They thought it was just an abandoned church rotting in the woods, something left behind by a vanished congregation. But when the floor cracked open beneath the feet of a young surveyor, named Harris, in the dense forest 30 miles north of Albany, what he found was not ruin or relic, but revelation, a truth buried so deep that even the trees above seemed to grow crooked trying to forget. What lay beneath the planks, it wasn't a grave, not in the ordinary sense. It was a vault, a long, dry cavern, packed tight with the skeletal remains of 143 people arranged, not haphazardly, but deliberately row after row, some curled in fetal positions, others stretched with arms outstretched, some with fingers snapped mid-prayer and all. Of them marked each skull fractured, and healed each femur carved with spirals and hooks, an unspoken language, as though the bones themselves had been turned into a script for a gospel. No God ever claimed, and the smell not of rot, not of decay, but of something old and scorched and quiet, filled the space like it had been waiting centuries to be remembered. The authorities arrived with lanterns and shovels, and faces that changed shape when they saw what was under that black church built of stone, darker than anything quarried in the region, a building with no windows and a steeple that reached too high and tilted wrong, and they documented what they could before the men from Albany came, not police, not army, something else, men who asked no questions, but took every journal, every bone, every name, and left behind silence thicker than soil. The official record lists them as unknown, remains cause of death undetermined, case closed, but the unofficial record, written in margins and whispers, tells a different story. It tells of broken limbs that had healed before death of lungs with fluid, damage repeated again and again, as if drowning was part of a ritual, and of symbols etched deep into the bone marrow, patterns of pain that no child should carry, and yet 23 of the skeletons were clearly under 10 years old small hands, still curled around invisible objects, perhaps ropes, perhaps rosaries. No one will ever know because they sealed it all and told no one. But some of us found pieces, fragments of what was meant to stay hidden, and we learned the name of the church not from the state, but from an old map stained with mold and time, the Church of the Pure Spirit, founded in 1825, dissolved without record, and never mentioned again, and the town around it, Ravenwood, erased from census records, vanished from postal maps, and remembered only in the fevered diaries of those who claimed to have seen things they couldn't explain, and the church was not white, not wooden, not a place of warmth. It was cold, it was stone, it was designed like a seal with 8 outer chambers, surrounding a central sanctuary. No windows, no altar, only a platform carved into a spiral that drew the eye inward and down, and the deeper they dug, the more tunnels. They found passageways that twisted into earth, like roots of something buried alive, and in those tunnels they found chambers, and in those chambers they found hooks, chains, scorched marks on the walls and rows of indentations in the stone floor, as if people had knelt there for hours or days or forever. The Ravencraft brothers, that name appears in no family line, no immigration ledger, no parish registry, but it appears again and again in the writings pulled from beneath that church. Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb, and they did not preach forgiveness or heaven. They preached purification through pain, suffering as the only path to the Spirit. And they said the flesh is the cage, and the cage must be broken, and the people believed. Then not because they were ignorant, but because they were desperate, grieving, hollow, and ready to fill themselves with anything, even agony, and the sermons they preached were not recorded in ink, but in blood and bone and silence, and the rituals they performed escalated from fasting to drowning, from isolation to branding, and when it was time for the final trial, they called it the Ascension, and those chosen never returned. There were journals found written in a cramped hand, possibly Silas's, describing the process of elevation, the slow breaking of the body to liberate the soul, the careful orchestration of trials, designed not to kill, but to purify, and every page was soaked with obsession words like sacrifice, elevation vessel, and spiral repeated, without pause, and one page ended with this line written over and over until the ink bled through the parchment. The flesh remembers what the soul must forget. The flesh remembers what the soul must forget. The flesh remembers what the soul must forget. And in one of the chambers beneath the sanctuary, they found a circle of stones stained, black, arranged around a pit filled with ash and fragments and teeth, and in that ash, someone had drawn a spiral again, and again with a finger as if even in the final moments, someone believed that if they completed the pattern, they would be freed, and maybe they were, or maybe they were consumed, because the bones left behind were hollow not from decay, but from something else, something extracted, something taken. The town never spoke again. Ravenwood is gone, the roads to it overgrown, the paths erased, but if you stand in the woods on the right, night in the right place, you can hear it a whisper, not of wind, but of breath, and sometimes in the stillness you can feel it beneath your feet, the weight of bodies that were never mourned, the echo of prayers that were never answered. And if you close your eyes too long, you might see the spiral, and once you see it, it sees you. This is not history. This is warning. This is the first gate, and you've stepped through it. Do you understand? What that means? Do you know? What comes next? Can you feel it in your teeth, in your spine, in the soft places that ache when no one's watching? That's not fear, that's memory, and it's waking up now. Shall I now continue dissection? 2 in the same format, without any gap, using only commas, full stops, and question marks, and revealing a deeper, darker, more realistic horror than before. They arrived quietly, without fanfare or announcement, without banners or sermons or invitations, the 3 of them riding into Ravenwood beneath heavy clouds on a summer afternoon in 1825. And though no one remembers the moment they entered the town, everyone remembers what happened after, because nothing was the same once they came, and nothing ever would be again. Their names were Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb, though whether those names were given or chosen remains a question that no record answers, because there are no birth certificates, no letters of passage, no family history, only the fact that the land near the northern ridge was purchased in gold. Not paper, not coin, but full-weight bars carried in a cedar chest that none of the 3 allowed anyone else to touch, and from that moment Ravenwood was no longer just a small farming town. It was something else, something waiting to be claimed. Elder Ezra was the one people saw first, tall, with a coat that never collected dust eyes, that never blinked too long, and a voice that settled into your spine like cold water. He did not shout or preach. He only looked at you as if he already knew what you had lost and what you were hiding. And when he finally spoke, it felt less like words and more like truth, sliding beneath your skin. Deacon Silas was smaller, with ink on his fingers and papers always tucked into his coat. He rarely looked up from his writing, but when he did, it was always at the exact moment someone was about to lie. And Prophet Caleb, the youngest, moved like a shadow, pale, with eyes that seemed too still and too blue, and a whisper that carried through rooms as if the air itself bent to listen when he spoke. And people followed him, not because he asked, but because he was already in their dreams, before they ever heard his name. They built the church in silence. No townsfolk were asked to help, and yet the stone was quarried and stacked with impossible speed and precision. A structure unlike anything seen in that region, or that time, black stone, rising into a pointed steeple, with no windows, and an octagonal main chamber surrounded by 8 smaller rooms. And when the locals asked why it had no windows, Ezra simply said light comes from within, and people laughed, but uneasily, because something about the shape, about the darkness of the stone, made them feel watched, and the laughter never came easily again, not after the first night when the bell rang at midnight, and no one had heard it installed, and yet it rang long and slow like it had been ringing for centuries. Already, at their first gathering, Elder Ezra stood on the central platform and said, "This is not a house of man. This is the vessel of the Spirit, and the Spirit demands purity, and the Spirit brings fire. And the Spirit has chosen this place, and you, and none." Of it made sense, but all of it felt real. And the people who had lost something, or someone, the people who had asked questions no one answered, the people who lay awake and wondered why they were still breathing when everyone around them was buried. Those were the people who stayed after the sermon and came again and again, not because they understood, but because they hoped, and hope is the beginning of surrender. The town changed slowly, but not secretly. Shops closed earlier, streets were quieter, children played closer to home, and no one walked past the church after sunset, not because of superstition, but because of a stillness that grew around it like a second skin. And those who joined the church began to pull away from those who did not. Their eyes changed, their voices softened, their hands trembled when they touched anything that did not belong to the sanctuary, and some donated land, some gave their savings, and some gave their names away entirely and began using only the names assigned to them by the church. And Prophet Caleb called it casting off the dead skin of the world and stepping into the light of the Spirit. It was Deacon Silas who introduced the doctrine of tribulation, explaining calmly in his sermons that suffering is not punishment, but purification, that the body is the vessel of sin, and only through breaking it can the Spirit rise. And he said it with such care and logic that no one flinched at first, not even when he explained the methods: fasting for days at a time, isolation and silent cells, cold water poured over the head in darkness, while hymns were whispered above. And these were called the soft trials, and they were only for beginners. The deeper rituals required what they called discernment, which was an interview with Prophet Caleb conducted in candlelight, where the questions were not about sin, but about memory, about loss, about fear, about dreams. And those who answered correctly were marked on the wrist with oil and told they were ready to be vessels of the Spirit. And once marked, they never returned home. They lived inside the church in silence. No one was forced, not at first, and yet no one refused, not after hearing Caleb speak in his sleep, not after seeing Ezra place his hand on a dying man's chest and watching the man convulse and then breathe again, not after Silas recited entire pages of a book that no one could read, and yet everyone understood in their bones. And when people began to go missing, their families said nothing because they believed they had ascended. And when the sheriff asked questions, he was found 3 days later wandering the forest with no memory and ash on his tongue. And when the mayor sent a letter to Albany asking for intervention, he was discovered in his study with pages of scripture nailed to his walls, written in his own blood, and no one ever spoke of that again. The deeper rituals were held at night, always at night, and only for those who had surrendered completely. They began with silence and ended with screams. And no one ever said what happened in the chamber beneath the altar, because those who survived the ritual were no longer able to speak, and those who didn't were not seen again. And the spiral that had been carved into the sanctuary floor began to appear elsewhere in the town, on doors, on fences, on the skin of those chosen, and people began to say that the Spirit was not God at all, but something older, something without a name, something that demanded pain as worship and suffering as sacrifice. And the ones who said this out loud disappeared or burned their homes and walked into the forest barefoot and were never seen again. Ravenwood was no longer a town. It was a congregation, and the brothers were no longer men. They were vessels, and the people no longer lived. They waited for the next trial, and the church no longer stood it breathed, and the rituals were no longer strange. They were salvation. And when the bell rang at midnight, every person in town held their breath, and some wept and some smiled, and no one asked why anymore, because they already knew. And when Ezra spoke now, he did not speak to the people, he spoke through them. And Silas no longer wrote with ink, he used bone dust and oil. And Caleb no longer walked, he floated just above. the ground his feet never touching, and his eyes never blinking, and the Spirit no longer whispered, it roared. And what they were building now beneath the church was no longer a chamber. It was a gate. It was never a coincidence that Ravenwood was chosen. It was not some accidental town tucked into trees. It was not random soil that received the weight. Of the Ravencraft brothers, it was selected and shaped long before anyone there realized it. And the reason was simple. The land was already primed already, softened by the endless groaning of the Second Great Awakening, a time when faith turned. Feverish, and men screamed their salvation under bleeding skies, and children shook on dirt floors as preachers declared that the fire of God would burn them clean. And New York had become the furnace where this madness was forged, a place so flooded with visions and prophets and trembling congregations that it was called the burned-over district, not because of war or plague, but because there was nothing left to convert. Every soul had already been seared. In towns like Ravenwood, people had seen too much and lost too much, and still they knelt and begged for meaning. And when none came, they reached deeper into the dark, hoping to touch something older than God. And the Ravencraft brothers knew this. They knew the exact shape of hunger and how to wear the face of divinity, and when they spoke, it sounded like Scripture, not because it was holy, but because it was hollow, and the people were ready to fill it with their own despair. They were not the first to bring fire to the hills, but they were the last, because theirs did not flicker, and vanish. Theirs stayed, and spread, and clung. And it changed everything, the way people prayed, the way they touched their children, the way they looked at their own hands, wondering what sins they had hidden in their skin. And churches across the region began to empty, not because of failure, but because something stronger had appeared, something with eyes deeper than doctrine and breath, colder than forgiveness. The older preachers tried to warn them, said these three men were not sent by the Lord, but by something lower, said their words rang hollow. If you listened with your soul instead of your ears, but no one listened because their churches were small, and their robes were frayed, and their sermons ended in silence, not ecstasy. And the Ravencrafts promised ecstasy, promised deliverance, through pain, not just metaphor, but the kind you could feel in your teeth and nails and joints and marrow. And what they offered wasn't heaven, it was certainty, and that was what the people wanted more than anything to know, to be told, to be stripped of doubt and baptized in something absolute. And the soil itself seemed to cooperate. The crops near the church grew faster, the animals bore more young, the rain fell more gently, and the wind never howled. And those who resisted, those who spoke out, found their wells dried, their roofs collapsed, their children sickened, their minds frayed, until they either joined or left. And those who left walked north and were never heard from again. And those who stayed no longer asked questions, only waited for instruction. It was during this time that the Church of the Pure Spirit began to write its own scripture, not copied from the Bible, but transcribed from visions received by Prophet Caleb, who spoke in a tongue that bled from his mouth in the hours before dawn. And Deacon Silas wrote everything on parchment, made from pressed animal hide, and bound with thread, pulled from the hair of believers. And these books were never read aloud, only pressed against the skin of new initiates during the ritual of binding. And they would scream and cry and convulse, not from pain, but from knowledge, because the words were not written to be understood. They were written to be absorbed. And every week the church welcomed new members, not by invitation, but by breakdown. Those who had lost children, those who had buried wives, those who had watched their homes burn in lightning strikes that did not come from storms they came not to, belong but to be undone. And the Ravencrafts promised them that they would be shattered into holiness and made pure again. And the fire in their sermons was not metaphor, it was literal. And they kept it burning in the center of the sanctuary, at all hours a flame that did not flicker or consume, only stared and pulsed and gave off no heat, only hunger. This was not religion, this was infection, and it spread, because no one could tell where faith ended and madness began. Not anymore, not in Ravenwood, not when the bell rang at midnight, and the ground itself seemed to hum, not when the trees near the church began to lean inward, as though listening, not when the dreams of those who lived nearby began to synchronize, and people reported seeing the same visions of spirals carved into flesh and eyes, with no pupils watching from the forest floor. And still no one intervened, because there was nothing to see, nothing illegal, nothing written, nothing said, only the fact that people kept disappearing, and no one seemed to care, and the sheriff no longer visited, and the mayor no longer ruled, and the land no longer belonged to anyone except the three who never grew older, never tired, never bled, and those who doubted that were invited to witness, and those who witnessed never doubted. Again, Ravenwood was no longer on the map, but it was still there, pulsing, waiting, growing, and the records that remain from that time are few and hidden, but one survives. A letter written by a schoolteacher named Hannah Reeve sent to her sister in Albany. It reads in part, "They no longer use names here, only titles. They no longer farm or sell or teach. They only chant and kneel and wait, and at night I can hear the earth beneath the floor breathing, and I do not think it is the devil, but I do not think it is God either." And after that letter, Hannah was never heard from again, and her schoolhouse was found burned to the ground with no sign of struggle, only the spiral carved into the stone beneath where her desk had stood. By 1827, the church had over 90 members, all living either on the compound or within walking distance, all giving their possessions to the Spirit, all surrendering their wills, all preparing for something none of them could describe. And when asked what they were building, they said it was not a building, but a gate, and when asked where it led, they said only inward. The darkness was no longer at the edge. It was at the center. It was the foundation. It was the mortar between every stone, and it smiled, and it waited, and it spoke through Ezra and Silas and Caleb, and it said, "You were born to be broken, and you are almost ready." It began with a single phrase spoken by Deacon Silas during a sermon that was never recorded, but never forgotten. The flesh is the vessel of sin, and it must be broken for the Spirit to rise. And though the words were simple, the silence that followed was not. People did not gasp or whisper. They only listened as if something long buried had just been remembered. And Elder Ezra nodded once, and Prophet Caleb closed his eyes and whispered something no one could hear. And from that moment, everything changed, because the church no longer existed to comfort. It existed to purify, and the rituals that had once been symbolic became real and sharp and wet, and the people who had once been lost became tools, and the fire that once burned to illuminate now burned to brand. The theology of the Ravencraft brothers was not written in books. It was written on bodies, etched into skin and carved into muscle, and taught through pain, because they believed salvation was not a concept. It was a condition, something to be earned, not imagined, and pain was the only true path to that condition. They called it tribulation, but it was torture, and they called it cleansing, but it was disfigurement, and they called it elevation, but it was death in slow movements. And yet the people came willingly and knelt and asked to be chosen, because they had been taught to believe that suffering was a gift, and that blood was currency, and that silence was the truest hymn. There were 7 trials, and each one was designed to strip away something essential. The trial of hunger lasted days, and ended only when the initiate collapsed. The trial of cold required immersion in a stone basin filled with ice water, where the body was submerged while hymns were whispered above. The trial of silence took place in a locked chamber without light, where the voice was not merely quieted, but forbidden, and those who spoke even a single word would begin again from the start. And the trial of breath was the first to kill. It involved the cloth, the water, the weight of hands on the chest. And when the initiate lost consciousness, they were revived and asked if they had seen the Spirit. And if they said no, the trial resumed. These trials were not punishments. They were preparations, at least that is what Deacon Silas would write again and again in the pages. Kept beneath his cot were diagrams of the human body, were marked with crosses and symbols and notations in a language that resembled Latin, but twisted and malformed, and those pages were found years later covered in blood that had dried black and had never been identified, and each page was numbered not in order, but in sequence as if meant to be read only during ritual and never aloud. Prophet Caleb claimed he did not design the trials, that they were revealed to him during visions, and his eyes would roll back and his body would shake and his voice would emerge in a whisper that echoed across the stone walls, and when he spoke, the room fell still, because no one could deny that what filled him was not his own voice, and what passed through him was older than language and colder than death. And those chosen for the deeper rituals did not smile or cry, they only bowed and stripped and laid themselves on the stone. The trial of fire required precision. The iron rods were heated in the flame that never went out and applied to the skin in specific patterns. Spiral circles overlapping triangles, and each one had meaning, though no one could explain what that meaning was, only that the marks were never infected and never healed fully and would pulse in the dark, and some said they moved just slightly when touched, and some said they whispered if you pressed your ear close enough. The trial of earth was simple. The initiate was buried beneath the church in a stone trench filled with soil, taken from the foundation of the sanctuary, packed tight from foot to throat, their arms pinned, their eyes blindfolded, their mouths sealed with cloth, and they remained there not for hours, but for nights. And when unearthed, they would either weep or scream or laugh or die. And those who laughed were never the same again, and walked differently, and spoke backwards in their sleep, and began to draw spirals in ash on every surface they passed. The final trial was called the hollowing, and it was never described fully, only that it took place in the lowest chamber beneath the sanctuary, in a room with no corners and no ceiling, only shadow and echo, and that it required not just submission, but transformation, and those who returned from it never blinked, and their pupils were no longer round, and their shadows did not match their bodies, and they were called vessels, and they were feared even by the brothers. This doctrine of pain was not spread quickly. It was fed slowly like poison in wine, until the town could no longer tell the difference between devotion and decay. And those who questioned the process were told they were not ready, and those who persisted were made ready through forced initiation. And if they survived, they believed, and if they did not, they were buried beneath the sanctuary, without name, without stone, and their bones were used to make new crosses, new benches, new implements for the next wave of faithful. And no one outside the church intervened, not because they were unaware, but because they were afraid, or perhaps they too had been touched by the whispers carried on, wind that never stopped circling the church. And there are letters from nearby towns written in desperate tones, speaking of dreams of eyes, of blood leaking from walls, of children speaking in tongues they had never heard. And these towns slowly emptied or burned, and nothing was done, because no one knew how to stop what was already growing inside them. The Ravencraft brothers claimed they were not the source, only the instruments, and they said the Spirit had chosen them because they had been broken in ways others could not imagine, and that what they taught was not new, only forgotten, and that the old ways had always required pain, and that paradise was never free, and every scripture they cited was bent, every verse turned to justify agony, every parable twisted into a warning that salvation could only be earned in screams and blood and silence. And people believed it not because they were weak, but because they were human, and humans will endure anything if they think it will save them from meaninglessness, from grief, from guilt. And the brothers offered them something more than hope. They offered them certainty and ritual and transformation, and the chance to leave behind everything that had ever haunted them and become pure, even if it meant they no longer recognized their own reflection. and those who watched from the outside, who read the letters and saw the signs. And did nothing, they too became part of the doctrine, because silence was complicity and fear was submission. And the Spirit did not care if you came willingly, only that you came eventually. And so the doctrine grew, and the trials deepened, and the spiral widened, and the bones piled beneath the sanctuary rose higher until they touched the floor, and the ground itself began to crack under the weight of belief and pain, and something ancient smiled from below and whispered soon. By the spring of 1828, the air in Ravenwood had changed not in temperature or scent, but in weight, every breath taken near. The church felt heavy, not just with moisture or pollen, but with something unseen, something watching something, pressing down from inside, and people began to speak more quietly, even when alone, and children no longer played near the tree line, and dogs refused to enter the churchyard, and the crops closest to the sanctuary grew twisted with vines that looped into spirals, and bled sap that never dried. And yet more people arrived, not fewer, some from distant towns, some from cities, most of them, not looking for shelter or work, but for absolution, and they found it in the promises whispered by Caleb in the oil-stained hands of Silas and the unblinking eyes of Ezra, who stood in the center of every gathering like the still point in a storm. And those who looked too long into his face often wept without knowing why. The church no longer recruited. It absorbed its teachings, no longer persuaded. They consumed, and by then the brothers had stopped holding public sermons. Instead, they performed private selection ceremonies, called invitations where a person would be led into the sanctuary and spoken to not in words, but in breath, and when they emerged, they either fell to their knees and begged to be hallowed, or they fled screaming into the forest and were found days later covered in scratches with no memory of their names, and some never returned at all, and the ones who did could not be touched because their skin blistered where human hands met them, and the spiral had begun appearing in their eyes, not just tattooed, but etched into the iris like a brand carved by light. Those who joined gave everything, their names, their lands, their savings, their children, and none of it was demanded, all of it was offered. And Deacon Silas kept a ledger not of money, but of purity scores, long lines of symbols and marks beside names. That no longer sounded like people, but like offerings, and those with high scores were taken into the stone corridors beneath the sanctuary to serve as vessels, while those with low scores were left outside the main chamber to pray for pain and punishment. And when one died, the others rejoiced not in mourning, but in envy for death inside. The church was considered a form of elevation, and their bodies were not buried, but placed in alcoves beneath the floorboards where the silence was thick, and the air did not rot. The children were not spared. They were considered blank vessels, and therefore more valuable, because they had no memory to unlearn, and the rituals performed on them were quieter, not gentler, but quieter, and the screams were muffled by hymnals sung in a tongue no one recognized. And it was said that those children aged without growing, that their limbs stayed small, but their eyes turned black, and their thoughts no longer belonged to them, and they were kept in a special wing of the sanctuary, where no adult entered unless summoned, and one woman, who claimed to hear them chanting in unison while asleep, clawed out her ears with a broken shard of mirror, and lived for another 17 days without uttering a sound. And when she died, spiral appeared on her spine, etched into the bone as revealed during the forbidden autopsy performed by the one surviving physician, who later walked into the river and never resurfaced. The deeper rituals became the only focus of the congregation, and ordinary life faded. No more farming, no more trading, no more letters to family, only devotion, only endurance, and every sunrise was greeted with blood drawn from the palms of the faithful, mixed into the mortar used to repair the sanctuary walls, which seemed to crack each night, no matter how strong the stone. In the end, Ravencroft brothers claimed the structure was alive, and the cracking was its breath, and the blood was its sustenance. And when it stopped cracking, they said the spirit would have no more need of this world. The faithful wore robes dyed in charcoal and stitched with hair, and their voices lowered over time until even their songs could not be heard by outsiders, and the forest began to lean inward branches, forming crude arches that pulsed with light. When the bell rang at midnight, and the wolves stopped howling, and the birds nested facing away from the steeple, and it was around this time that even the records stopped, because no one who entered the church returned with memory intact, and those who escaped wrote in broken lines with drawings of eyes and mouths and circles with teeth. And many tore their own skin, trying to remove what they called the mark, even when no mark was visible. One surviving document recovered from beneath the floorboards. Decades later, a confession written in blood on cloth, not paper, tells of a ritual called the merging, where one vessel was chosen to carry the burden of many, and inside them were placed the thoughts of 12 others, through a process involving bone dust and chants that lasted 7 days, and the vessel did not speak again, but when touched could deliver visions to the one who touched them. And those visions always ended in the same image, a mouth not open, but folding inward, swallowing itself endlessly. And the document ends with the line, "The more we give, the less we remain." And beneath it is a spiral drawn, with a single stroke beginning at the center. The population of Ravenwood by this time had thinned not by exodus, but by offering. And those left behind were not people as they had been, but remnants still shaped like men and women, but hollowed out like driftwood, and their eyes glistened in the dark, and their movements no longer followed rhythm or reason, and when they spoke, it was often to someone no one else could see, and they laughed when thunder rolled, and cried when the sun rose, and sang when blood touched the stone. By the end of that year, the sanctuary bell no longer rang at midnight, because midnight never ended the sky above. The church remained in twilight at all hours, and travelers who passed within sight of it reported the stars disappearing above the steeple and the ground vibrating beneath their feet, and their horses refusing to step further, and all maps began to show Ravenwood with faded ink, as if the land itself was forgetting its own shape, and no authority intervened, because those who tried were lost to madness, and those who witnessed what was buried beneath the church were never able to speak again, only draw spirals in ash, and whisper through cracked teeth that the spirit was not done. And yet still more arrived, broken, bleeding, desperate, and they were embraced not healed, and they were stripped not clothed, and they were taught that to suffer was to ascend, and to vanish was to arrive, and the doctrine no longer needed words. It needed only pain and silence, and the spiral which had become more than a symbol had become a door. By the winter of 1829, the church had ceased pretending to be a church. It no longer held services. It no longer opened its doors to strangers. It no longer rang its bell. It had become something else entirely, something that breathed and pulsed and remembered, and it was no longer called the Church of the Pure Spirit by its followers. It was simply called the body and those who lived within. Its stone walls were no longer called men or women or children. They were called veins, they were called nerves, they were called mouths, and their purpose was not salvation, but continuation. And what continued beneath that roof was not life as it had been known, but something remade in silence and fire and flesh. The underground chambers had grown deeper, no longer simple basements or catacombs. They had become a labyrinth, and not one built by human design, but by submission. Each new passage dug only after a dream, only after a whisper, only after a member awoke, speaking in a voice not their own, and pointed to where the stone must be broken. And the deeper they dug, the louder the voice became, until it no longer whispered, but hummed, and that hum was felt not in the ears, but in the teeth and the bones. And it did not fade. It grew louder with each brick laid, with each torch lit, with each scream swallowed by the earth. The sanctuary floor was no longer wood. It was now covered in skin, not fresh, not decayed, just skin. stretched tight, cured in salt and ash, and beneath it ran channels of blood collected during the trials and rituals and redirected through stone. Grooves carved in spirals, and no one dared step on the floor without removing their shoes, because the floor responded to pressure. It pulsed, it warmed, it exhaled, and no one asked what lay beneath it anymore, because they already knew, or because they no longer needed to ask. It was in that winter that Prophet Caleb received what he called the final vision, the vision of merging, the vision of unveiling, the vision of return, and for 3 nights he did not eat or drink or speak, and his body withered and cracked, and his eyes bled, and when he rose on the 4th day, he was not the same. His voice had deepened and split into tones that overlapped like chords, and his hands no longer bent at the knuckles, and his spine curved backward, and when he walked, the stone did not echo, and the faithful knelt in silence as he entered the sanctuary and laid his hand upon the spiral at the center of the floor and said, "The door is ready." The door was not made of wood or iron or stone. It was not a metaphor. It was a circle cut into the deepest chamber beneath the church, a circle that had no hinges, no frame, no seams, just a void in the rock that no tool could shape and no torch could illuminate, and those who gazed into it for more than a moment began to shake and weep and forget their names and speak in patterns, and those who touched it returned changed. Not mad, not broken, just different, slower, colder, quieter, and they were kept in a separate wing of the church where they slept standing and never closed their eyes. On the night of the first unveiling, December 21st, the longest night of the year, the congregation was summoned not by voice, but by instinct, and they arrived barefoot and robed and silent, and they formed a circle around the spiral, and each held a candle carved from the fat of the vessels who had failed the trials, and above them the ceiling groaned not from wind, but from something heavier, and the sanctuary walls bled from the mortar, not water, not sap, but a clear fluid that smelled like smoke and teeth. And Prophet Caleb stood in the center and said, "The sheep are ready." And Elder Ezra replied, "The gate is hungry." And Deacon Silas began to write not with ink, but with his own blood, and he wrote not on paper, but on the floor itself. And the words vanished as soon as they were written, but the floor pulsed brighter with each one. The ritual began not with chanting, but with breathing, every member inhaling and exhaling in unison, until the air itself grew thick, and the torches dimmed, and the spiral at the center began to turn not physically, but perceptually, and the more you looked, the more it moved, and the more it moved, the less you wanted to look away and Prophet Caleb raised his arms and screamed a sound that was not a word but a command, and from beneath the floor came a sound like bones grinding and water boiling and metal being pulled through flesh, and then silence, and then something answered. No one described what emerged, only what remained afterward. The spiral was now open, not just in shape, but in function. It could be entered, and those who entered did not return in body, but their voices remained. They whispered from the corners of the sanctuary. They breathed through the cracks in the stone. They dreamed inside the mouths of the children, and the spiral was fed not just with blood, but with memory, with sound, with belief, and it grew, and it spun, and it deepened, and from that night forward nothing in Ravenwood could be called human. The Ravencraft brothers no longer talked, they no longer spoke, they no longer slept. They simply stood around the spiral and listened, and sometimes they would smile, and sometimes they would cry, and sometimes they would bleed without being touched. And the faithful would gather to collect that blood and smear it over their own eyes and ears and tongues, and wait for the vision to begin. Outside, the town had vanished from the maps, and the trees had grown tall enough to block the sky, and the animals had fled, and the wind no longer passed through the valley. It curled around it as if unwilling to enter, and the earth beneath the sanctuary had begun to hum, not in sound, but in vibration. And it was said that if you lay flat on the stone, Your heartbeat would slow to match the pulse beneath, and that, if you stayed too long, your blood would run backward and you would begin to remember things that had never happened to you and forget things that had. It was no longer a church. It was a wound, a living wound in the world, place where something that should not be had begun to become, and the faithful were no longer worshippers. They were scaffolding, they were framework, they were the structure through which it could rise, and what it was had no name, only the spiral, only the eye, only the door, and all who entered gave up language, because language was limitation, and pain was truth, and transformation was inevitable. There are no more records after that night, only fragments, only warnings, only scars, and those who tried to find Ravenwood found only forest or fire or silence, and those who tried to dig beneath the ruins found bones twisted in ways that suggested movement after death, and those bones bore markings, not made by tools, but by teeth, and those teeth did not match any known animal or man, and the spiral continues, not because it was preserved, but because it was planted, and it grows where silence gathers, and where faith becomes hunger, and where flesh becomes door. It began just before midnight, on the longest night of the year, with the air inside the sanctuary, thick like oil, with the cold outside, sharp enough to crack bone, and inside they gathered not to pray, but to witness something none of them would understand until it was far too late, and Elder Ezra stood silent beside the spiral, with hands open, not in welcome, but in surrender, and Deacon Silas wrote nothing for the first time in months, as if even his ink knew it could no longer capture what was coming, and Prophet Caleb emerged from the shadows behind the altar with no robe, no shoes, no words, only a mouth too wide, and eyes that no longer looked outward, and in his voice something else spoke, something that said the time has come to make hollow what was full, and to crown the broken, and to crack the shell, and from the 100 silent mouths in the room came only one reply: we are ready. The 3 chosen were named in a voice that did not echo, but still rang in every skull: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters. And when the names were spoken, the others did not cheer or weep. They bowed heads and held breath and made room in the spiral's path, and the 3 walked forward not with pride or fear, but with the kind of emptiness only grief can teach, because they knew even then they would never leave the sanctuary again, not as they had entered, not as they had been. And each had come to this place with lost Sarah, with the death of her infant twins Michael, with the disfigurement from fire, Rebecca with the drowning of her sister, and they believed this was healing. They believed this was answer, but what they received was nothing like comfort, and everything like consumption. They were stripped to their underclothes, despite the cold, despite the stone beneath their feet, and each was bound to a frame not upright, not cruciform, but inverted, the cross turned downward, as Elder Ezra explained. This is not defiance, this is return from heaven to earth, from spirit to flesh, from life to the place where breath begins again through suffering. And Deacon Silas read from a scroll not made of paper but sewn skin, and Prophet Caleb spoke a language no one else knew, a language not made of words, but pulses and gurgles and moans and clicks, and it filled the chamber like a sickness, and even those who had never questioned the ritual began to tremble. But none stepped back, because doubt was worse than death, and faith meant holding still while the blade approached. The first trial was ere Sarah Pembroke, her face covered in linen, soaked in ice water, while a clay jug was tilted slow above her mouth and nose, and she bucked and kicked and gasped, but the ropes held tight, and Elder Ezra placed his hand gently on her forehead and said, in time you will thank the silence. And when she lost consciousness, they counted to 7 and brought her back, and her first words were not words at all, just a low hum like the spiral's voice in miniature, and her eyes stared through the ceiling as though she could now see beyond the stone. The second trial was earth for Michael Collins. They buried him not outside, but beneath the sanctuary soil, hauled in and sanctified by blood and salt packed around him until only his nose remained exposed, and Deacon Silas sang low as the others pressed their palms into the dirt above him, and spoke not prayers, but confessions. Their sins soaked into the earth around his body, and when he was dug up 5 hours later, his nails were gone. His teeth had cracked, and he wept not from fear, but from gratitude, because he said the weight had spoken to him, and that it remembered him, and that it was hungry for more. The third trial was fire for Rebecca Winters. A spiral of coals laid out across the stone floor, and she was walked barefoot across it 7 times, each step held for the duration of a prayer, and the flesh of her soles burned black and peeled, and each time she cried out the congregation chanted, through suffering comes purity, through purity comes elevation, and by the 7th pass she no longer screamed, she smiled, and when she collapsed into the arms of Elder Ezra, her mouth was still smiling, and her blood hissed when it touched the stone. The 4th trial was water for all 3, submerged one by one in a pit dug into the center of the sanctuary, filled with water taken from the river, where local animals had stopped drinking long ago, and the water was near freezing, and the screams that emerged from their mouths were not from the cold, but from what they saw beneath the surface, something that moved without shape, something that breathed without lungs, and when they were pulled out limp and pale, they could no longer speak, and when they were wrapped in wool and laid beside one another, they held hands without knowing why. The 5th trial was shadow a room with no torch, no sound, no warmth, only the absence of everything, and each was placed inside, alone for a full day, with no food, no direction, no rest, and those who listened at the stone door claimed they heard not silence but laughter and singing, and at one point the sound of chewing, and when the door was opened, Sarah was blind. Michael had bitten off his own tongue, and Rebecca had scratched the spiral into her own chest using a sliver of stone, and none of them remembered doing it. The 6th trial was the offering, and this time it was not given. It was taken a finger from each, a tooth from each, a memory from each, extracted not by blade, but by chant and touch and song, and when they screamed, the sound was absorbed by the spiral on the floor, and those screams echoed from the walls for hours after the ritual ended, and no one could meet the eyes of the Ravencraft brothers afterward, not because they were ashamed, but because those eyes now burned with something that made the skin crawl, and the stone whisper, and the blood curdle in the vein. The final trial was the hollowing, and it was done not in public, but below in the deepest chamber, where the spiral had opened, and what happened there was never recorded, only described in fragments by those who cleaned the sanctuary afterward, by those who buried what remained, by those who whispered in sleep about mouths without tongues and spines, bent backward and skin turned inside out, and the 3 were never seen again, not truly. But those who attended that ritual said that the spiral now pulsed in time with breath, and that the sanctuary no longer needed light to see, and that the church itself was now alive. And when Prophet Caleb emerged, his body twitching, his lips cracked, his feet bleeding, he said only this: the flesh has been rewritten, the door is open, the breath is no longer ours. And Elder Ezra replied, it has begun. The 3 never returned in form, but their absence did not mean silence, because the spiral now spoke in other ways, in the turning of leaves against the windless sky and the dripping of blood from walls, not touched in the dreams of those who had never entered the sanctuary, and yet woke screaming with their eyes burned black and their mouths stitched closed, and in the shifting of stones beneath the town that had once been Ravenwood, which by spring of 1830 was no longer a village, but a skin stretched over something old, or something moving, something waiting, and the residents who had never joined the Church of the Pure Spirit began to change without being touched, and those who remained in their homes began locking doors that had no locks and boarding windows that had never been broken, and they whispered that they heard singing from the trees, not voices, not music, Something between the two, something that felt like memory and fire and decay. Children born in Ravenwood that year did not cry when they emerged. They exhaled and then stared, and their eyes did not blink for hours, and their hearts beat too slow, and their spines too long, and some were born with fingers fused or with ribs that clicked when they breathed, and one child was born with no mouth, but still made sound, and the midwife who delivered him bit through her own tongue and died smiling, and they buried her beneath her own floorboards, because the spiral had said. She was clean, and the boy lived for 7 years without eating, and spoke only to the stones. And when he died, the room in which he passed remained warm for a month, and anyone who stepped inside felt as though they were being watched from within. Their own lungs. Those who tried to leave found their wagons overturned, their horses panicked, their maps rewritten, and even when they crossed the town's edge, they still saw Ravenwood in their dreams, in their mirrors, in the frost patterns that formed on there. Windows miles away, and many returned not because they wanted to, but because they had no language left for anything else, and the town's name no longer appeared on official documents. But when travelers passed the forest edge, they found signs that had not been erected by any hand, with letters carved too deep into rotted wood, and symbols etched with teeth, and when they looked away, the signs vanished, and when they looked again, the trees had moved closer. Mails stopped arriving, and roads washed away, and the soil turned black and soft, and smelled of copper and rot, and roots grew in spirals beneath the ground, and the livestock gave birth to stillborn shapes, and the crows began to gather in hundreds. And their eyes were red, and the rivers ran slower, and the moon stopped rising in the right place, and at the right time, and the sun dimmed at noon, and shadows lengthened even when the sky was cloudless, and even the air felt old as though it had been breathed too many times by something too large to see. The Ravenscroft brothers were no longer seen in daylight, if daylight could still be called that, and when they appeared, they did not walk, they drifted, and when they spoke, it was always from behind you, and when you turned, they were never facing you directly, and Elder Ezra now bore a wound in his chest that did not bleed, but pulsed like a second heart, and Deacon Silas no longer wrote in books, but on the bodies of the faithful, carving words into skin that vanished an hour later, leaving only the memory, and Prophet Caleb no longer had a voice. But when he looked at you, you knew what you must do, and what you must give, and what you must lose, and all of it felt not like sacrifice, but inevitability. The sanctuary had grown taller, but no stones had been added, and the steeple now bent slightly like a spine under pressure, and the windows remained absent, and the lanterns burned without fuel, and sometimes the flames turned black and floated toward the ceiling and never came down, and no one questioned it, because no one remembered what fire used to be, and the pews had been removed to make space for the spiral, now fully carved into the floor, not painted, not etched, carved through the entire thickness of the stone, as though the church had been built atop it, and not the other way around. People began to vanish, and the town did not mourn them, because no one remembered their names, and sometimes an entire family would be gone, and their home would collapse inward, and be covered in vines within hours, and when someone asked where the house had been, the others would shake their heads and say, "There was never a house, only trees, only earth, only stone," and at night the trees closest to the sanctuary began to twist in on themselves, forming knots and eyes and mouths, and one man who tried to chop down a spiral-rooted birch found his axe returned to his doorstep the next morning with a note carved into the handle that read, "The flesh is not yours to open," and when he ignored it, he was found weeks later inside the church, folded in half lengthwise, with no visible cuts, and eyes replaced by pebbles that bled. By summer the animals had stopped dying. They simply disappeared, and the plants grew without sunlight, and the rain stopped falling. But the ground never dried, and one girl who wandered too close to the sanctuary entrance, returned holding a stone that pulsed like a heartbeat and refused to let it go, and she was fed through a straw and bathed in silence, and the spiral grew into her palms. And when she died, the body weighed twice as much as it should, and smelled not of decay, but of cinnamon and sulfur, and whatever touched her skin saw things that were never written, but always remembered. And the room where she was kept had to be sealed with ash and salt, and even then the walls continued to weep. Ravenwood was no longer a town. It was a pattern, a rhythm, a thought repeated too, many times until it broke and rewrote itself, and the few still knew what it had once been whispered in corners, that the ground was no longer ground, that the people were no longer people, that the sky above the sanctuary had cracked, though no one could see it, and that light now entered only by permission, and left only when summoned, and that the church of the pure spirit was no longer a place, but a mouth waiting to be fed. And the faithful now spoke of the coming turn, not an apocalypse, not a rapture, just a turn, like a page, like a key, like the world itself was a shell, and something inside it was stirring, and soon it would open, and soon the spiral would no longer be hidden, but everywhere. By autumn the air itself had changed, not in scent or in temperature, but in weight. Every breath felt heavy. Every sound arrived late and never fully formed, and people began forgetting things that mattered, their names, their ages, their children's faces, and the spiral fed not only on blood, but on recollection, because a memory removed is a space created, and the spiral needed space. It grew best in absence, and the more they forgot, the more it grew, and soon they could no longer recall the faces of those lost in the trials, nor the names of the three who ascended, nor the reason the sanctuary had no windows. And by the end of October some could not remember what the sun looked like, or if it had ever really risen at all. The spiral had no need to speak any more. It was understood without language and moved without instruction. And when the wind blew through the trees, the branches creaked in rhythmic pulses, not random, not chaotic, but precise, like breathing, like counting, like the slow, steady turning of a gear in a machine that had never been built by hands, but by hunger. And those who listened long enough began to sway in time. And one woman was found standing perfectly still for 3 days, her feet rooted in soil, her mouth open to the sky, and when someone whispered her name, her skin split, and from within poured something like salt, but softer and wetter and shaped like letters. And when the wind caught it, it whispered the word return. By winter the land around Ravenwood had turned to marsh, but no rain had fallen. The snow melted before touching ground, and the frost collected not on windows, but on tongues and teeth, and the livestock that once ran now stood in rows unblinking, unmoving, and those who touched them felt their own heartbeat pause and a pressure build behind the eyes, as if something were watching from the inside. And one boy reported hearing his mother's voice come from a dead goat's mouth, telling him to dig and dig. He did until he struck something that rang not like stone, but like bone hollow, bone arranged in a spiral, and when he reached down to touch it, he vanished into the earth, with no sound, no splash, no trace, and only his boots remained, neatly aligned beside the hole. The sanctuary had changed in ways that defied architecture, its interior wider than its exterior, its steps deeper than its foundations, and its rooms no longer ended, but curved until the walker returned to the same point, without turning, and the thing. Deeper chambers now breathed a cold that did not rise from the stone, but fell from the ceiling like a fog, and within those chambers were no altars, no pews, only shapes pressed into the walls, like hands or faces or ribs or thoughts, and those who entered returned altered, or not at all, and the faithful stopped counting the missing, because the spiral had taught them that to be taken was to be carried, and to be carried was to become part of the whole. Prophet Caleb no longer moved in daylight. His limbs had lengthened, his joints reversed, and his eyes remained closed, but still glowed beneath the lids. And when he passed, the walls wept, and the floors cracked, and every candle in the church guttered. In reverse smoke, curling down into wax, and when he spoke it was only to the dead, and when he touched the living, they began to rot in slow silence from within their skin, never breaking, only sinking as if collapsing inward, and he smiled through it all as if remembering something too large to fit inside time. Deacon Silas had carved the spiral into his own spine with a chisel of bone, sharpened against the teeth of the blind girl born beneath the sanctuary, and though he never screamed, those who watched claimed their dreams grew darker each night. They remembered not his pain, but the shape of it, and that shape appeared in frost and flame and fracture, and they began to see it in their own reflections, not drawn but embedded in the glass behind their eyes. Elder Ezra had grown taller, though his back remained bowed, and his fingers split at the tips, into barbs that could write without ink on any surface, and what he wrote became permanent, not in matter, but in meaning. And if he inscribed your name, your past was erased, and your future sealed, and those so marked would eventually vanish into walls, or into the forest, or into each other, and their absence would feel not like grief, but like resolution, as if the spiral had closed a loop. The town itself had ceased all resemblance to anything ever chartered or named. The roads curled back on themselves. The trees leaned inward in rows too perfect to be natural, and the sky above was no longer blue or black, but bruised like old fruit. And the stars did not rise. They rearranged and formed not constellations, but words. And those who read them wept until their tongues fell out, and still they tried to speak, because the meaning behind those shapes was not knowledge, but command, and obedience was no longer a choice, but an instinct. And even the crows began to fly in circles above the sanctuary. Their eyes plucked out, their beaks bloodied, their wings never flapping. Visitors did come from time to time, surveyors, wanderers, pilgrims, lost men drawn by dreams. They could not explain, and none returned whole. Some lost their faces, others lost their bones. Others still were never seen again, but their voices lingered. In wells and barns, in the silence before a child cries, and one man returned without, his skin but smiling, and said only one thing before crumbling into salt. It's not a church anymore. It's a body, and it's waking up. And so the spiral moved outward, not in force, not in invasion, but in idea. It entered stories and lullabies and folk songs sung by children in towns miles away, and those children began to draw it in the dirt, with sticks, with blood, with fingernails. And they never remembered where they had seen it, and only that it made them feel calm, safe. Chosen and parents began waking in the night to find their infants, standing at windows whispering into the dark, and when asked what they were saying, they replied, "It's listening, and it's cold, and it's close." And the spiral spread not like fire, not like plague, but like forgetting it erased what had been, and replaced it with need, a need to kneel, a need to bleed, a need to become, and those who denied it still found it in their thoughts in the angles of staircases, in the patterns left by mold on walls, and it spread through letters and dreams and old books found in barns and songs hummed by dying grandmothers, and it spread through time and through silence and through the spaces we pretend don't exist, and it fed on doubt and grew in reverence, and one day soon it would not need faith at all. By the spring of 1831, there were no boundaries left between mind and place, between thought and stone, between the spiral and the people who once believed they were following it because it had already passed belief and had already surpassed devotion. It was now embedded in function, in perception, in the cellular memory of the body, and the deeper truth emerged not from the mouths of the prophets, not from the rituals or the screams or the candles, but from the silence that came after, when nothing moved, when nothing breathed, when the spiral no longer needed to grow, because it had already been there from the beginning. The sanctuary had disappeared, not collapsed, not abandoned, simply gone. The place where it once stood was now only a field of stillness and sky, where no birds flew, where no wind passed, where sound was absorbed like breath into lungs that no longer exhaled, and the people of Ravenwood no longer called themselves anything they moved, but did not walk. They spoke, but made no sound. They worked in the fields, but harvested nothing. And when strangers came, they wept without knowing why, and turned back with their eyes darker than before, as if something inside had been mirrored and warped and returned. The spiral had become a part of language, but not in the way we think, not in letters, not in symbols, but in rhythm, in cadence, in the hidden space between the words. The pauses, the breaths, the unfinished thoughts that echo louder than full sentences. It had learned to speak through us, not to us, and every story, every prayer, every whispered secret in every tongue now carried the residue of its structure, its curve, its thirst, and those who heard it even without knowing would one day return to it in dream, in illness, in death. Prophet Caleb had become part of the air. They said his bones had dissolved, his skin flaked into spores, his eyes become twin knots of memory, pulsing beneath the surface of the land, and sometimes when the fog crept too low and the wind stilled. Too long people reported seeing his outline standing where no shadow should fall and hearing his breath inside their own chests, and when they tried to speak, they found their mouths full of dust. Deacon Silas left behind no body, only pages, endless pages, made of something too soft, too thin, too alive, and each page contained no ink, but still bore words that only appeared when read aloud, and when read aloud, the reader would forget their name, forget their past, forget their shape, can fall to the floor with eyes open and pulse still, and the page would vanish, and no one could remember what was said, only that it had to be said, only that it was the truth. Elder Ezra was never seen again, but his handwriting began to appear across the country in cemeteries, in abandoned churches, in medical records and census books and birth certificates, where the names were slightly wrong, but the spiral appeared. In the spacing, in the curve of the letters and the breath behind the line, and archivists would sometimes pause mid-task and begin weeping or laughing or humming a tune they had never heard, but could not stop singing until they tore their own ears or gouged their own tongues, and even then the sound continued as if their mouths were no longer the source. And in the generations that followed, the spiral was not spoken of, but still felt in the instinct to kneel before emptiness, in the need to carve names into stone, in the comfort found in pain, offered freely in the hunger for silence deeper than thought. And whenever a child drew circles in the dirt, or whispered into corners, or spoke in languages they never learned, the old ones would say nothing, but would listen carefully and watch the trees for movement and avoid mirrors after dark. Ravenwood no longer appeared on maps, but it still existed, not as place, not as ruin, but as echo, and sometimes when the fog rolls in too thick, or the stars vanish from the sky, or the breath leaves the lungs slower than it should, people ask questions they never remember asking, and see shapes they forget before they can scream, and hear music that sounds like memory folding in on itself, and they carry that residue with them forever, even if they never return. The spiral is not a church, it is not a cult, it is not a god, it is not a curse, it is a structure, it is a shape, it is the system beneath, the skin of the world, and it was never discovered, it was only remembered, and now you have heard it, now you have seen it, now it is within you, and if you find your dreams changing, if you find your hands tracing unfamiliar patterns, if you feel yourself forgetting something you used to know so clearly, do not panic, do not resist, do not pray, because the spiral does not punish, it does not judge, it does not care. It only turns, and turns, and turns forever.